We're going to have a brief, about 10 to 12 minutes tops presentation. And then following that, we're going to break into our discussion. So you've got your discussion guides on your table, which really are with you, which are really there to act as a resource. There's also some pink pieces of paper with some discussion questions that are really focused on the new mobility piece. And we'll run through those in a bit more detail before we get started. After we have those discussions, you've got a facilitator at each table, potentially two, depending on which table you're at. They're going to help facilitate the conversation. They're also going to be taking lots of notes. They're going to do a short report back after we have our conversations, and I'm going to take some notes based on that so that after the 2 rotations this morning, when we do go back to the room, myself and the other facilitators in the room are going to do a short report back so that we get a flavor, even if you didn't get a chance to go to a couple of the rooms, you get a flavor for what those discussions were in some of the other rooms. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pina from Waterfront Toronto, and she's going to take us through the presentation.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Pina Malazzi. I'm the Vice President for Design at Waterfront Toronto, and I'm joined by Alex Mariou, who's our Project Manager for Transportation and Transit. Welcome to the Mobility Room. Everyone's looking for mobility, right? Yes. Okay, yay. So Waterfront Toronto, since its inception, has been committed to the delivery of transit and, in fact, undertook a very extensive planning in the area of transit, including leading the environmental assessment for the Eastern Waterfront Transit Line, which is a planned LRT that would run along Queens Quay and out into the Portlands area. We've successfully delivered both one of the first new LRT lines in Toronto on Cherry Street and a revitalized complete street on Queens Quay, which you saw in the plenary presentation this morning. As part of the process, Alex, myself, and our mobility team started by establishing a series of objectives for the Quayside project. Those included the kind of primary objective of reducing automobile emissions in order to achieve the climate positive targets that they'll be talking a lot about in the sustainability room today. Some of the strategies for achieving this objective include things like reducing automobile dependency and accommodating electric vehicle infrastructure. Another objective was to reduce congestion for all modes of transportation. And what we mean by that is it's not just about congestion on streets like you see in the image here, but it's also the rise of curbside congestion as a result of car share, Uber, Lyft, things like that. But it's also the congestion we noticed on the Martin Goodman Trail. Upon completing that project, we are seeing upwards of 600, 700, 800 cyclists an hour through the AM/PM peak using that cycling route, a lot more than I think we ever could have imagined. We're also talking about ensuring that we have affordable mobility choices so that everybody has access to mobility. It's key to being able to get good jobs, move around the city. We want to ensure safety for road users, and particularly safety for vulnerable users, pedestrians, those who have limited mobility, and lastly, universal accessibility. We've had several meetings already, and in those meetings, we've heard a lot from stakeholders. I just want to walk through a summary of the feedback from our first round of consultation in July. This is just a sample of that feedback. If you'd like more details, you can refer to our full consultation report, which you can find on quaysideto.ca, which is the website for this project. On the left side, from a support perspective, something Alex and I heard a lot about at the at every meeting we've had around this project is the importance of getting high-order transit to the waterfront, and I think there is no question that that is critical to the success of the project. From a sustainability perspective, a commitment to climate positive and sustainable modes has always been received very positively by stakeholders, and cycling, a commitment to improving cycling as much as we possibly can on the waterfront. Areas to consider, we heard about access and the concern that Quayside not feel disconnected from the rest of the city. If everything's new and different in Quayside, there was a concern that maybe people wouldn't understand, once they cross the boundary into the site, how you move around in the area. Vulnerable users continues to be an area that we're asked to consider more and more, and how we find innovations that can help to make it easier for them. From an accessibility perspective, ensuring that the innovations, for example, something like curbless streets, don't create a barrier for accessibility, and ensuring that mobility remains affordable to everybody. So, This is what we're here to talk about. In the mobility pillar, we established that by when we read through the proposal that came from Sidewalk, there were 32 solutions that applied to mobility. As you heard in the plenary, that's 32 of the total 160 solutions for the entire project. A full list of the 32 solutions for mobility can be found in attachment number 4 of the discussion guide that everybody should have received when they entered the meeting. Each of these little red dots you see here represents one idea or solution that you can read more about in that guide. After completing our thorough review of each of the solutions, which included our internal mobility team, but also external consultants, we undertook a ranking exercise. We ranked the effectiveness of each solution based on the objectives that we set over a year and a half ago. We evaluated the risks and trade-offs for each of the solutions, and we took into consideration all the feedback that we heard through our consultation on each solution. And we supported 31 of those 32 solutions. So we've actually supported within 3 different degrees or categories of support. In the category of support and advocate for regulatory reform, we've put 6 of the mobility innovations. In the category of support and advocate for government funding, we've bucketed 9 of those solutions. In the category of support with WT investment, we've bucketed 4 solutions. And then there are 12 solutions we consider to be very effective, but that they're better suited to be left to the private sector to implement. As noted in the plenary, these conclusions do not mean that Waterfront Toronto has approved moving ahead with the project or a partnership with Sidewalk Labs. It does mean that Waterfront Toronto sees merit in including these solutions in our draft innovation plan as we move forward. I am now going to turn it over to Alex, who's going to tell you about some of the solutions, some of those 32 solutions.
Thanks, Pina. So as Pina said, I'm just going to take you through about 4 representative solutions to just discuss how our approach to evaluating them. So as Pina said, there are about 4 different categories for support. So this first one is an example of a solution that Waterfront Toronto has evaluated, and we concluded that we would like to support through our own investment. So this is a wayfinding beacon. So the idea behind a wayfinding beacon is that it broadcasts information. So in the example of the picture here, this might be an example of a wayfinding beacon, and this beacon broadcasts information about the environment that can then be picked up by third-party apps, wayfinding apps that are used by partially sighted or blind people. An example of such an app is called Blind Square, and I think it's being piloted right now at Yonge and St. Clair. So as opposed to just having GPS tell partially blind or partially sighted or blind person how to navigate an environment, these beacons add another layer of information to help facilitate the navigation of public and private space. So another example of a solution that we would also support through our investment is expanding the active transportation network to the front door of all buildings within the precinct. So the dark line green up here is a proposed cycle track in the city's proposed cycle network, and then the other dark line down here is the Martin Goodman Trail, which exists today. But the other dashed lines aren't part of the proposed cycle network that represent actually delivering good bicycle access to the front door of all the buildings. So the side streets would also have bicycle facilities. So this ensures safe and comfortable bicycle access to all buildings and increases the area that is comfortable for cyclists and pedestrians. Another point on our conclusion here is that we'd invest with WT investment is that we're responsible for delivering the public infrastructure to the site, so it's not a stretch to ensure that the road infrastructure would include bicycle facilities. So here's another example. This is dynamic curbs, which is in the discussion guide actually made up 3 different solutions. This is an example of a solution that we would support and advocate for through regulatory change. So right now, this couldn't be implemented within the current regulatory structure. But what this is doing is providing, one, flexible space. So on one day or one point in time, there might be high demand for curbside use for pickup and drop off. Maybe there's an event and there's a lot of pickup and drop off activity on the curb space. And then maybe at another time, a Sunday afternoon, maybe there's a lot of pedestrians and that space could be used for the public realm or for pedestrian space. So where those blue rectangles are, that whole area could move down and become more pedestrian space as opposed to being used for vehicles. So another part of this is actually streamlining the communications involved with that. So right now, on the side of the road, you might see whether or not you can park there, and you have to read a static sign, and you have to depict it and figure out whether or not you can park there. So part of this would be including digital signage so that whatever is permitted at that point in time would be broadcast on a digital sign. And then the other element of this would be pricing. So fairly pricing the use of that curb space. And then one last example that we'll go through of an example that we've supported. This is a discounted mobility package. So one part of this is grouping several services together in one package at a discounted rate compared to what you'd pay for each of those services individually. And then putting that group of package or a group of services through one access point, an application, let's say, that groups all of those services and provides information on those services. So this also, through this process, can encourage the use of sustainable modes and create synergies between modes and link trips using a variety of modes. And then one example of a solution that we didn't support is raincoats that you see depicted here in this image. Now, we asked Sidewalk Labs to propose solutions to improve outdoor comfort, and we're still committed to solutions that improve outdoor comfort. Just this specific approach to doing that is something that we couldn't support because it would require footings in the public realm and would create barriers for accessibility. You can imagine potentially walking into that. So that was something that we would like to explore more in terms of finding other solutions to improve outdoor comfort, but this specific solution we didn't support. So that wraps that up, and I'll hand it back to Matt.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to run you through these just really quickly, and then we're going to move quickly because I want us to try to consolidate and make sure we have someone to facilitate each of the conversations, but don't move yet. We'll do that in just a second. So we're really here to kind of get feedback on the emerging evaluation and specific to the new mobility solutions. So there's 4 questions. So kind of at the top and broadest is, do you agree with Waterfront Toronto's conclusion that Sidewalk Labs' proposal sufficiently addresses the challenges we are trying to address? Why and why not? And in this room, we're focusing again on the new mobility solutions. Are there any solutions that you want to see Waterfront Toronto prioritize? If so, which ones and why? And then are there any that you have concerns about? And if so, which ones and why? And then anything else. Again, if there's other things that you and your table want to discuss, we definitely want to hear about that. But the intent of this room is to really focus on the new mobility solutions. So if you're a facilitator, put your hand up. So we've got 3 of us here. We want to try to get ourselves to 2 or 3 tables. And we've got lots of empty spots up here with Darnell. And Claire, why don't you come right here to this table? And so if you're sitting at one of the back 3 tables, I invite you to join us up here so that we can have conversations, and I'll work my way to this table here. So if you're not at one of these 3 tables, make a quick move to one of these 3, and we'll start the conversations, and we'll report back in about 15 or 20 minutes together. And Waterfront Toronto staff, just the last thing, I just looking at Alex and reminded myself, the table facilitators are really here to document the feedback and to make sure that everyone at the table gets a chance to be heard. They are not subject matter experts. That said, Waterfront Toronto staff in the room are. They will be floating around amongst the tables. So if we have questions we need answers to, they'll be there to answer those questions. Thanks a lot. We're going to take 5 minutes or so just to hear from the table facilitators, kind of on key points, key kind of common areas, if there was any areas of difference at the table as well. And then we'll get a chance to rotate. You can stick around here if you want to hang out with myself and the others from the team, or you can move to one of the other 4 rooms or 3 other rooms available as well. So Darnell, I'm going to come to you first. If you want to just give us kind of a 2 minutes tops kind of highlight of what you guys talked about, and then we'll move on from there.
Sure. So the general consensus here was that we are certainly behind where we could be, and therefore the innovation that are being proposed here are a way to move forward. It's certainly great that it's being talked about, because we need these sorts of sustainability innovations moving forward. And there was a feeling there was a lot of thought put into the process here. In terms of specific thoughts, certainly there were lots of questions about e-scooters and how to redistribute them, and concerns about how some of those shared mobility items would be both used and dealt with so that they do not impede people. There were questions regarding the tunnel system proposed, as well as sort of, how that would actually function so that people have choices, and how does this 12-acre plot connect to the wider services within the area, and questions about, of course, delivery services and how things move within and out. There was also, apart from certainly dynamic curbs, which also came up as something that the people here at the table supported. There was certainly also questions about, how are we going to roll these things out to the rest of the city and actually see them benefit more than just the 12 acres at Quayside.
Great, thanks very much. Claire, where are you? Claire?
Thank you very much. Whoa. All right, we had lots of good discussion at this table. One thing that we heard right off the bat is that there was lots of positive feedback on the consultation, the entire process, and talking about engaging folks in it. And to duplicate what Darnell's table said about spreading out the good innovations and applying them elsewhere, so using the technology that could be incorporated at Quayside, then also getting it to bleed out to other parts of the city. We had some discussion about the integration of mobility packages and how that could actually work. So the idea is that you'd have TTC, Presto, all of it integrated with things like Uber and Lyft, and how that might possibly work. We also discussed about not having cars there, and how that would be supported in moving into electric vehicles and other alternate means of transportation. There were some concerns that we discussed about it being a tri-government proposal, in the sense that it might be fine now, but what would happen in subsequent years when there's another election, and how that might actually come to be. And then we also had a discussion about public transit and LRT, and not just the money for it, but the connection. So if there's an existing network in the city, how we would connect that to Quayside, because obviously for it to work and to increase mobility and enable other people to use it, then there would need to be money for it, and it would need to be able to connect to our existing system.
Great, thanks very much, Claire. So a common theme, I think, amongst all the tables that we talked about was thinking about how we roll out some of the solutions or innovations from here to other parts of the city. We also talked about, kind of from a big picture, about really identifying what the, I want to say the big hope, or the big hope was for this. So kind of bringing it up to a more kind of accessible or simplified way of explaining what that is, so that people can understand that, and then getting behind the more specific solutions as well. We talked a little bit about providing access, parking, one of them, understanding what the parking needs, getting people here so they're not having to drive, but also understanding what kind of the parking standards are and if those need to change based on new technology. And we really talked about kind of future proofing as well, in terms of that while we can understand some things that are coming forward in terms of future technology, making the space flexible and adaptable to new future technologies, so that we have the ability to respond to those as they come into place. Not electric vehicles, but autonomous vehicles was one of the things we talked about, and making sure the infrastructure is in place for that as well, because it changes the ownership models, changes all sorts of ways that people move around. and get around to the space as well. I've got a number of other things. If I've missed any from our table, feel free to, I know I haven't gotten everything in detail, but those are kind of the big pieces as well. We just have a couple minutes left. I was just given the signal that we've got kind of 3 or 4 minutes left. If there's anything else anybody wants to kind of share with the whole group, anything that's missed, or if hearing from the other groups kind of sparks some other ideas, we've got a minute or two for that, and then we can get up and rotate to one of the other rooms. So I'll just open it up. I'll come around with the mic so that we can hear, although we're not that big of a group. But also, I know there's some recording being done so that we can get that captured on the recording too. Anything else anybody wants to add, or any kind of questions?
Sorry, in terms of regulation adaptation for the new technology, how fast we engage the regulators would be very important, because otherwise it can slow down the process.
So that was one thing, and I'll let one of the Waterfront Toronto people speak to that if they have any comments. But one of the things we talked about too was how are places like fire departments being engaged, and we talked about how the fact that that's going to be coming as one of the next steps is engaging regulatory bodies, the other levels of government, things like that too. But Pina, did you have anything to kind of add to that? Yeah.
As you said, it's part of the next phases of work. Our CEO, George, was previously at the province and has suggested that an approach that we use is one that's been used on various other projects he works on, is to develop government task force to work through some of the difficult issues. We don't need one for every single issue, but we have a couple big nuts to crack if this project goes ahead, so we can use task force to work through that. And it would include folks like the fire department to help us work through how we make some of the mass timber components more feasible given the regulations we have now.
Thanks, Pina. Anything else? Yep. Steve?
Sure. I was going to mention security becomes a big issue with people that are working in bars and nightclubs, even restaurants, when they're getting home at night. And I didn't see anything in the proposal about, how do people that are working in this area of the city, how do they get home? And I know this is something with the college that's on the waterfront too. They have a group now where some of the guys are walking the girls at least as far as Union Station. But they're talking about really safety later at night. And it's really hard for people that are working in a lot of the service facilities. And if you tie that in with the aging demographics in Ontario particularly, there's going to be a lot of services required. And some of those are going to be required off prime hours. So there doesn't seem to be in the proposal addressing the issue of safety and security of people being able to move around that are providing these services. I don't know if there's any comments that you've seen.
So from my point of view, I'll take it as a piece of advice for the team. I've got it written down, but I don't know if Pina or Mike, I want to say Alex, I don't know why I said Mike, Alex, have a response, if there is anything kind of imagined in the current solutions, or how Waterfront Toronto's thinking about that either.
Yeah, I'll take a crack.
Sure.
I think part of the nature of the Eastern Waterfront now is that it's in basically a construction phase, and the street isn't designed or built to the final standard yet either. So at the point in time in which that's all built out and it's a populated community, then the street will be well lit. There will be people. It'll be activated, which just inherently creates a safer community. But I think some of those challenges that exist on the Eastern Waterfront are by the very nature that it's in limbo, so to speak. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm just going to come around to Lorenzo.
I just got a real quick follow-on
Sure.
Around the construction phasing. And maybe this is a way, and the idea that we're using this as an example for other areas of the city that are developing. So this notion that, phasing is going to happen, and there's a tremendous amount of disruption during the construction. But is there a way that we can up the game? And I know I've heard stories about how the Japanese deal with construction and how they manage, people movement as well as automobile movement. So can we up the game around the construction management, given that it's going to take, probably quite a few years for all of this to come to full build out? So upping the game around how we deal with it, so it's not so ugly and disruptive and dangerous and so on and so forth, whether it's physical safety or, you know, personal safety and so on.
There are agile principles followed by some of the construction companies.
So just really up the game.
Yeah. And Lorenzo, we can again take that as a piece of advice, and I know the city is also going to be holding its own consultations in relation to this, and know from work we've done with them separately that there's construction management plans and things like that, and we'll make sure, I imagine they'll be looking at the consultation from this, and they're following along closely too, so they'll be able to hear that advice too. I'm just going to finish with Robert, and then we'll look to move on to the next station.
Sorry, Matthew. One of the ones that I don't think you covered was virtual.
Right.
So what can we do to make the community as accessible as possible to virtual mobility? So like people now, you know, work in Starbucks or whatever else with Wi-Fi and everything. But if you're trying to conduct a meeting with someone, that's still too much ambient noise and everything. So like, you know, what are we doing to create spaces within this community where you can have a little bit of reduction in the noise and therefore be in a better position to be virtual mobile instead of mobile in terms of walking?
Thanks very much. So with that, we're going to make a move. There's time to visit one more of the rooms before we head back to the plenary. So all three rooms are more or less in the same spot. The main room where we started, then there's one room just beyond it on your right, and then the other room if you just go straight through. And there's signs outside all of the doors for those rooms, and the titles of them are on your agenda as well. Thanks a lot, everyone.